Okay, so welcome to our talk with Nigel Poulton. We wanted to speak to Nigel around the launch of his new 2021 edition of the Kubernetes book, and Nigel's open to any questions around that, or Docker, or any containers afterwards. And what the format of this will be is Nigel's going to talk to us to start with for 20 minutes or so about the work he does, about Kubernetes in general, where it's come from and where it's at the minute, and where it might be heading to, and where his work fits in with that, with the work you do in sort of teaching and how you came across it and everything. And then we'll head into an open format Q&A, so that gives everybody a chance to ask a question to Nigel about any of the subjects that are relating to this. He'll do his best to answer them to the best of his abilities. I've got David and Mike here, who are our practice leads at Amsource, and they'll be moderating the Q&A and asking the questions on your behalf. Nigel has said the best question, the one that he finds the most intriguing, will win a signed edition of the new 2021 Kubernetes book. So that's an enticing prospect for somebody to come up with a great question, and we've got a few questions already that people have sent across when signing up. But if I hand over to you, Nigel, to get going and lead us through your talk of that portion of the webinar.
Cheers, Raj. So just a couple of minutes to get a few things set up and what have you. I'm assuming I'm going to go ahead and share my... can I get some screen sharing capabilities, Raj?
Oh, of course you can.
So just while we're sorting that out, I see we've got a few people on the call. I'd be super keen to know who you are and where you're from. So feel free to pop in the chat your name, where you're based. Before we kicked this off live, we were talking about which football teams we supported earlier. I'm a Sunderland fan. I know we've got some Huddersfield fans on. Be keen to know what football teams you support as well. So if you want to, go in the chat. Like Raj says as well, though, excuse me, I am going to be totally open to answering, or at least trying to answer, any questions with regards to technology in general, containers and Kubernetes, of course. I'm also fair game for questions around what it's like to write a technology book. I've gone down the route in the past where I've written books for a publishing house. The books I write at the moment are self-published. It's a totally different experience. I'll even talk to you a little bit around money and what it's like, how much you can potentially earn and more so not earn as the author of a technology book. So any questions around anything like that, I am properly game for. So I have just, while I did that, lost the screen. Well, I know you can see my screen, but I kind of wanted to see the questions that will come. Here we go, the chat. Has anybody said where they're from or who they support? Toon. Right. Okay, so we've got Kalisha from India. That's very cool. So I'm really sorry if that's a Newcastle fan. We need to evict them. We've got a Chelsea fan. Oh, okay, nice. Oh, in Leeds, but as a Glasgow Rangers fan. Okay, no worries. Good to meet you all. Totally appreciate your time. We want to make value of your time as well, so I will crack on with the presentation. So this is me. I'm Nigel. I'm based in the UK. I have worked with... Do you know what? I was working with Docker really early on. So I started using it heavily at Docker 0.9, which is, if you know much about Docker, is when they kind of ditched LXC in the background and went with their own lib container sort of internals. How do we manage containers anyway? Look, the point is I've been working with containers for ages. I'm a Docker captain, for whatever that means. I get some, well, I don't dismiss that actually. I get an inside track on what's coming, what's going on. I get internal access to people at Docker. It's pretty cool. I've written a bunch of books. 3 of them are on the screen right now. And I also do video training courses all around cloud native technologies like Docker and containers and Kubernetes and stuff. So we're going to talk about the Kubernetes book, right? This is the one hardback edition that I'll sign and give away to whoever we decide is the best question. Questions, start firing them away in the Q&A panel or in the chat. I don't mind. The guys in the background will manage it. And look, even if I can't answer your question, if it's a great question, we might choose the winner. But the thing is, you're not allowed to argue with who we choose as the winner. Our decision is final. But before talking about the book, right, I think it's more important to talk about why Kubernetes, because Kubernetes came before the Kubernetes book, right? So quite a while ago, I was at an HPE Discover event. It's like an in-person HP trade show event, if you haven't been to it before. This was years ago. I was invited there by HPE. They paid for my flights and all my accommodation and stuff like that. And I'd been to a few of their events for them. And I used to blog about it. That was what they got out of it. And I was at this one particular HP Discover event when the first DockerCon was going on the same week. And I remember saying to my hosts who paid for me to be there, because I've been doing a little bit of work with Docker, I was like, guys, like, I'm really grateful that you've paid for me to be here, but I just really wish I was at DockerCon. And they're like, that's a bit rude. But we got talking about like, well, why do you think that? And it plays into why Kubernetes and why I ended up writing the books about it. But when I first started working with Docker, it really reminded me of when I first came across virtual machines, or VMware in particular. And a lot of you on the call might have been involved with VMware in the early days. Not necessarily working for VMware, but I mean like deploying virtual machines when they were a new thing. And I still remember like the first time I came across the concept of a VMware virtual machine. Like, no joke, my head was blown. It was such a simple concept. Like, take a physical server that at the time we were running one application on and totally wasting its resources and taking ages to order and procure them and stack them in the data center, and, you know, long lead times to deploy them and you know, basically underutilizing them. Take that same physical server, slice it into whatever, 10 virtual machines, yeah, and run 10 applications on them. It was like mind-blowing and game-changing. And I remember thinking at the time, this is going to change the world. And of course it did. And I think a lot of people, you know, individuals and organizations saw what was coming there and said, well, from an organizational perspective, look, we can cut costs and we can also slash lead times in deploying new servers and new applications. But as individuals, people were like, do you know what? This is going to be a thing. And if I want my career to be on the right trajectory, like, do I want the best jobs and the best pay going forward and the best projects? Then it's going to be centered around virtual machines. Or a lot of it is, right? The idea being, if you're an organization or an individual and you didn't get on board with virtual machines, you were eventually going to be left behind. But it was a technology that just made so much sense to me. Now, when I first saw Docker containers, I felt the same. I was like, it really brought back those virtualization dreams, or those feelings I had when I first came across virtualization. Like, man, this just makes so much sense. It's going to change the world, and let's get on board with it as an individual. Now, it turned out that containers were more game-changing, or they changed the way that we design and deploy applications a lot more than virtual machines did. So the change that came with containers was more than what came with virtual machines. And we're still experiencing that change to a large extent now. But I really felt like getting on board early was going to be an important thing for me. And it has turned out to be that case. And I know for a lot of other individuals and a lot of organizations, getting on board with containers early, they're reaping the benefits of that now. Now, to say if you were just about to start getting on board with containers and Kubernetes today, are you late to the party? No, you're not, because there's still a lot of things that are in alpha and beta or the early stages of development that are growing and still maturing. So we're certainly, I think, still in the early days. And I see that on the uptake of both my books and video courses, but also the people that reach back out to me and thank me for those resources, right? I'm starting to see. So originally it was people that were kind of in startup type companies, born in the cloud companies that don't have their own data centers or anything, yeah? Excuse me. Whereas increasingly now I'm seeing companies and individuals that work for large enterprises and your more traditional companies starting to take their first steps with containers and Docker and Kubernetes. So if you're just thinking about getting into the game now, or you're not into it at all, or you're just getting into it, it still is a good time to get in. You can still reap those benefits without being kind of late to the game. So Kubernetes as a project, right? Kubernetes is is the container orchestrator of choice in the market. And there's buzzwords there, right? So like we used to get VMware sprawl or VM sprawl, we still get container sprawl, but container sprawl is almost sometimes 10x what your VM sprawl was. So if you needed help with VM sprawl, you need help even more with container sprawl. So managing all those containers and the applications that they run, but also bringing things like the ability for those applications on containers to self-heal, to dynamically scale up and down based on demand, things like that. Kubernetes brings all of that to the party, because you can't manage all of that as a human being or as a team of human beings. You need a machine, for want of a better term, or you need a platform to do it for you. And that platform is Kubernetes. Now, it's open source. It came out of Google. It's got the backing of every enterprise company out there, every cloud vendor out there. Everybody is behind it, giving it like a super bright future, if you will. So like if you're looking to say, okay, so the learning curve to get onto containers and Kubernetes is a bit steeper than it was for virtual machines, I'll just be honest. I'd understand if you're a little bit hesitant as to like, well, is it worth me as an individual for my career putting in the effort to learn this? But also from an organization perspective, is it worth me investing time and capital in skilling up my teams and people to learn containers and Kubernetes? And the evidence or the writing is all over the walls that yes, it is. Everybody is behind this. The momentum is strong. And it's almost a modern VMware juggernaut, if you will. It just, everything that you look at shows that it has a super bright future, and it's getting easier to deploy and work with all of the time. So the other thing is, right, anybody that knows Star Trek will know of the Borg and the idea that resistance is futile. They're coming along and they're going to assimilate you as a race or a species, and don't even bother arguing with them because they're going to steamroller over you. And the same applies very much to containers and Kubernetes. Now, like, really isn't a time to put the blinkers on or stick your head in the sand and pretend that it's not happening, or to try and step to the side and think, well, it'll pass us by and we'll be fine. Like, if you think about where you would be now as an individual or as an organization, if you did nothing to do with virtual machines, like if it was a foreign concept to you, you would be behind on all accounts. And like I hinted at before, I know sometimes we refer to, or we think of containers as virtualization 2.0, and in a lot of ways it is, but it's much more disruptive. It's changing a lot more as we move to this sort of deployment model. So if you didn't get on board with virtual machines, you'd be left behind. The amount you'd be left behind or will be left behind in the future, if you don't get on board with containers and Kubernetes, will be even more than you would have been if it was virtual machines. Yeah, because more is changing here. So you'll find that not only your lead times and your deployment times will be behind everybody else's, but your practices and the ability to bring in the right staff as well, because all of the best talent and the best people are going to be wanting to work with technologies like containers and Kubernetes going forward. So I just feel like on every aspect, both as an organization and as an individual, you really want to get on board with this. And I'll say as well, right, that while, yes, it is the future, if I just wind back to when I got my first Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer certificate, MCSE in Windows NT 4, what I had to do to get that, or look, just in general, to skill myself up in Windows NT and Windows 2000 and things like that, I had to beg and borrow this humongous, two humongous compact PCs from my employer at the time, with one of those, do you remember those massive monitors that you needed a forklift truck to lift them? Well, I had one of those on top of two PCs with an old keyboard video mouse switch in the corner of my bedroom, dusty as heck, right? It took me 5 hours to build, let's say, a Windows 2000 domain. The best way to learn is to break stuff, right? So I would break them all the time. Then it was another 5 hours to rebuild. So that was like an overnight job. It was just really hard to learn stuff back then. But we really live in a golden age of learning technologies these days. So there are books and things out there. You've seen the pictures of mine. I think they're great. Okay, the reviews are great. But look, there's loads of book resources out there. Video courses. I've got so many video courses on containers and Kubernetes. Things that didn't exist 20 years ago when I was learning Windows NT. The ability to spin up infrastructure in the cloud, trash it, and build it again in minutes, right? Or even on your laptop, to have like a development environment like Docker Desktop or something, which lets you work with Docker and Kubernetes on your laptop. You can trash it and rebuild it in 2 minutes. Like, it's never been like this before. So don't be afraid of taking that step to learn, because the resources and the tools and the platforms to enable you to learn they're just like what we've never had before. So all of this Kubernetes and container stuff is going on. Why on earth did I decide to write a book? Because I'll be upfront with you. It's really hard work writing a book. There's not a massive amount of money involved with it, but it is massively rewarding. I will give you that. But I didn't know it was rewarding until I'd actually written the book. So the reason I wanted to write a book is basically down to this book here, Mastering Windows Server 2000 by Mark Manassi. I've still got a copy of this book, but when I was learning Windows Server 2000, this was, in my opinion, the best book that I'd read in my life. I took it on my honeymoon with me. So I read it at the side of the pool. I read it at the beach in Santorini, where we went for our honeymoon. I literally read every page of that book. And I remember thinking what an influence it was on my career, how it helped me take that next step. And I always wanted at some point to give something back. And it was a dream to write a book, because this book had been so influential to me. I thought, maybe I can do something like this for other people. Now, the other side of it was that I'd also spent my own hard-earned money on other books at the time, learning different technologies, including Windows Server, actually, that were rubbish. And I hated having spent my hard-earned cash, because I was young, probably early married at the time. Money was tight. I'd hate to buy a book, read the particular chapters I wanted, and still not understand it after I'd read the chapters. It really sort of grated on me. So I wanted to write not just a book, but I wanted to write a book where the explanations were as clear as possible and people would love it like I loved that book. I will tell you, it was super hard work writing a book. So the first book I wrote, I haven't shown you, is called Data Storage and Networking, because I'm a former storage and networking guy. And I wrote it through a publisher. Very hard experience. I do self-publish my books now. Still hard work, don't get me wrong, but I have a lot more flexibility and freedom, which I'll come to in a later slide, actually. I am a little bit conscious of the time, so I'll probably go maybe at the most to the bottom of the hour, then we'll open it up for questions. Also, nobody wants to sit and listen to me just drone on for super long. But here's a tweet that I put out a while ago. Now, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's 4 chapters of my book called Quick Start Kubernetes, and they are literally full of annotations. So what's happened at this point is I've written the book in Markdown, okay, so code effectively, yeah, and I've read through it several times and I've tweaked it. I think at this point I've probably read it cover to cover 4 times in the process of writing it. It's been spell checked. I think I've sent chapters to Ash, my brother, to have a look at probably. I've had my wife look at it to proofread bits. When I come to print it out on the printer like this is when I think I've got a few little tweaks to make, and then it'll be ready for production, for printing. Because when I print it out like this, it is different reading it when it's in fully printed format to reading it in Markdown. But as you can see, I think I've put there, of the first 4 chapters, there were only 2 pages that weren't littered with things that I needed to change or tweak. So I've gone through probably 2 months of writing, and I've got to this point and I think I'm about ready to print this book. And I print it out on my printer for a final proofread. And I'm like, wow, this needs so much more work. So it is a lot of hard work, but it is super rewarding when it's done. Now, I want to talk quickly about the Kubernetes book, this one here, right? And a couple of reasons why I think, I'm not going to say it's the best book. I mean, yeah, I think it is, but of course I'm going to think that, right? Because I wrote it. But a couple of reasons that I think it's a great book, right? So probably first up, community ingress and the Kubernetes API, right? So I first published this book, and we'll see it on the next slide, in July 2017. It was, I think, about 15,000 words long, 15,000 words long. When I initially published it. The latest version is about 75,000 words long. So it has massively grown over time. And that's been due to community feedback. And of course, because Kubernetes as a project has grown. But the book, because in the past, I think when I was doing the stats on this, I was looking at them yesterday, I've had 10 different editions of the book since July 2017. So usually 2 editions per year, sometimes 3 editions per year. And now I'm moving to 1 edition per year or 1 update per year because Kubernetes as a project is more stable now. But in the early days, as the project was growing and as things in the project were changing, I was updating this book fast because, don't get me wrong, as an author, I'd love to write this book, put it on the shelf, and it'd be useful for 5 years. But if I was to look at the 2017 edition of this book, almost all of it is out of date now because at the rate at which Kubernetes and containers are evolving and developing. So a really important part of this book is it's never out of date. So you go and buy a hardback or a paperback copy off the shelf today, and I guarantee it will not be more than 12 months old. In the past, I've guaranteed it won't be more than 6 months old, but we don't need that now that the project is solidifying a little bit. If you buy an electronic copy of the book, you get all of the updates free of charge. So when you buy it, you're not buying something that's out of date. So that's been really important. An example, has been Ingress and the API as well, right? So I've had a lot of people asking me to explain how Kubernetes Ingress works. So I've put that in the latest edition. Also, the Kubernetes API, I've had a lot of people from particularly a sysadmin background coming to try and wrap their heads around Kubernetes and saying, people are talking about the API all the time and the API server. I don't know what it means. Can you please explain that to me? And it's so fundamental to Kubernetes. And people are saying the things that they read on the internet about explaining an API assume 2 things. 1, that you're a developer, and not everybody's a developer. And 2, the explanations about APIs seem to assume that you already know what an API is. So I take the fact that I'm not the cleverest guy in the room by a mile. So I find it hard to learn new things. So when I write things, I come from the perspective that, like, look, if I can write this in a way that somebody not very clever like me can understand, most people will finish a chapter and be like, thank you. Now I finally understand something. So community feedback, regular updates are a hallmark of the book. So we went from this original book on the left in 2017, where it was the #1 new release at the time. I think it was the first ever book written on Kubernetes that you could buy from Amazon. I know my Docker book was the second ever book, and I'm pretty sure this Kubernetes book was the first ever one, to the point now where it's got over 500 global ratings, 4.5 stars. In fact, the only stars really, genuinely, that I get that are not 5 stars tend to have been on older versions of the book that say pretty much it doesn't cover everything. Or I'll have people will write a comment on the book and give it 1 or 2 stars and say it doesn't cover something or whatever, some aspect of Kubernetes. And it can't cover everything of Kubernetes, right? Because it'd be 10,000 pages long. But I kind of pull my hair out as an author when somebody says, I'm giving this book 1 or 2 stars because it doesn't cover, in the past, Ingress, right? I'm like, well, you can look at the contents of the book before you buy it, before you spend your money, and see that there's not a chapter on Ingress. So I don't need to, but I'm defending the book a little bit here by saying, if you look at any of the reviews really that are not 5 stars, it's always people that are saying it doesn't cover everything or it doesn't cover this particular thing. And I'm like, well, no, have a read of the contents before you spend your money. But I think the fact that it's quite often a #1 bestseller in different categories and that it's regularly getting ratings shows that it is still a valuable book today. And this particular, we're only 3 or 4 months into 2021, 5 months actually, And this is the 2021 edition is the edition that you'll be buying if you buy it now. So what content is in there is the important content, and it's bang up to date. I'm going to just kind of wrap it by saying this is the kind of fun that I can have as a self-publishing author. Let me just take a quick drink here. So a simplified Chinese edition just went on the shelves last week, sorry. The Russian translation will be available in ebook at the end of this week, and a Spanish translation will be available in the next month or two. Being self-published means that I can approach anybody that I want, or people can approach me, and we can just work together on translations and stuff like this without a big publishing company getting in the way. Speaking of getting in the way, these are my two favorites, right? Now, I apologize if you don't really know Star Trek, but for the last 2 or 3 minutes, right, before I wrap for Q&A, Kubernetes was originally based on an internal Google project called Borg. Borg managed Google's internal containers. It was scheduling and all that kind of stuff for things like Gmail and search. So like every time you do a search in the background, Google spins up a container, does your search, destroys the container. Managing all of that was an internal project called Borg, based on the Borg from Star Trek. Interestingly, if you look at the Kubernetes logo, you'll see it's got 7 spokes, which is a bit of a tip of the hat to a Borg drone called 7 of 9. The 7 spokes being from 7 of 9's name. Anyway, look, the thing is, right, Kubernetes has a bit of a history with Star Trek. So the red book at the bottom there is a Klingon collector's edition, right? So the YAML and the title on the front there is in Klingon writing. The rest of the book inside is in English, of course. Okay, nobody actually reads Klingon. But because it's my book, I was able to do a Klingon special edition. And I'm just in a row at the moment with Amazon for this one on the right, which was supposed to be released this week, which is a Borg edition. So that says the Kubernetes book in Borg writing, and it's written by Nigel of Borg. This is shocking if you don't care about Star Trek, right? But I'm having a row with Amazon at the moment because they're saying the title on the front of the book doesn't match the title in the metadata. And I'm like, it does. It's just you can't read the font. That says the Kubernetes book, letter for letter, you just can't read the font. And I even got an updated avatar of myself for this Borg edition, which hopefully will be on the shelves next week. But I'll just wrap by saying, look, containers and Kubernetes, if you're into technology and you like tech, they are super cool, they're game-changing, and they're going to be here for the long run. That's what all the writing on the wall is saying. As an author, and potentially you as a potential prospective author in the future, it's really hard work writing books. Financially, it can be super challenging. But if you write a good book, and I'm sure you would if you did, the feedback and the connection that you get with the community and with people can be super rewarding. I'll give you an example on the cost front, right? So one of my other books, Docker Deep Dive, I published a new version of it I publish a version of that about every year as well. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I did a major update to it where I doubled the book in size. It went to over 400 pages, loads of new content. I was super, super proud of it. Believe me, I put months into adding that new content, formatting it properly, all the diagrams, getting the binding right. I went to upload it to Amazon self-publishing service, and it said, because of the printing costs, the minimum price I could sell the book for was $52. Now, previously it had been $35. Now, I ended up pricing the book, I think, at $55 as a round number. So I made something like after their take as well, and I only take a percentage of royalties, I was making less than $1 per copy. And it was heartbreaking for me because I wanted the book to be a $35 book, but the printing costs for Amazon were just sky high. Partly because I'd gone with color pictures on the inside of the book. So that book never really made me any money, but loads of people loved it. So just making that connection with people, because I had other revenue streams at the time, meant that I could get by without having to rely on that book, meant that it was okay. But there is a lot to think about. I would say that writing a book, the two main things that are great about it are that you get connections with people in the community, and it's a business card as well, right? So you can say that you are the author of a book. The downsides of it are it takes a lot of time, and the financial rewards are not always, you're not going to be, look, writing a book on technology, you're never going to be J.K. Rowling, unfortunately. But as long as you understand that, it can be a super rewarding experience. And on that, like, I'm open to questions and stuff. I hope that was worth people's time.
That was really good. Thanks, Nigel. Really interesting.
No, that was really good. Thank you very much, Nigel. Yeah, we're going to open it up to the Q&A now. So if Mike, you want to lead off, you and Dave want to.
Yeah, well, it's the Q&A, but it's actually more like the Kedarnath show. Because they've been super busy all the way through. I think all the questions, except for one, because the one from Ash doesn't count, right? Is he winding you up there?
I haven't read it. We can just go from the top if you want.
Yeah, okay. So, well, the very top one is from Ash. How is KCAD pronounced?
Oh,
CCAD.
So I pronounce it CKAD. So we do have plans to do a CKAD book later this year, and we were just chatting about the title for the book yesterday. So that's an in joke.
Yeah. I thought it might have been pulling your leg there.
Yeah.
But the first one after that is the first of many from Kedarnath. How do containers actually work under the hood in Kubernetes?
All right. So, okay. So that's container D. Right. So it's a really good question, actually. So, just to wind the clock back a little bit, right? So if you know virtual machines or VMware, kind of the low-level tool is ESXi. And then you tend to wrap a bunch of ESXi hosts with Virtual Center or whatever, right? I'm not a VMware expert, right? Containers take a similar approach where you need something to actually run your containers. Now, traditionally, that was Docker. And then let's say you have a cluster of 10 machines, right? And all 10 of those machines would run Docker. And Docker would start and stop the containers and all that kind of low-level stuff. Then sitting above those 10 machines would be Kubernetes. And you'd throw your work at Kubernetes, and Kubernetes would say, right, I need a cluster node that will be able to run this container. Right, let's say it's node 6. So it would instruct Docker on node 6 to pull down the image for that container and start the container and join it to any networks. And it's a good model, right? The problem was that Docker did more than just start and stop containers. So it was oversized for that task. In fact, Docker does a lot of what Kubernetes does. So for Kubernetes to use Docker is like really a bloated solution. So what the community did was it stripped out the start and stop container stuff from Docker into a new project called Container D. So Container D, you can just think of it as a lightweight Docker. It will start and stop containers and pull images and things like that. Just the bits of Docker that Kubernetes wants. So on your 10 cluster nodes, it don't have to be 10, right? You install Container D, and then Kubernetes sits above those, and it schedules work to Container D on each of those nodes. I hope that clarifies that.
Great. So I think the next question is from Kalesha, who said, how is Ebpf going to help Kubernetes?
So this, unless we get a better question, this might win the signed copy of the... I don't want to get hopes up, right? Ebpf as a networking protocol and technology is flipping white hot at the moment, right? In fact, I did see that Microsoft have just announced an open source project to port or to make Ebpf work on Windows as well. But one of the best things about Ebpf is the way it's starting to be implemented in Kubernetes now is it is able to crack open a network packet and read Kubernetes-related metadata inside the packet and make routing topologies and routing decisions based on Kubernetes metadata. So you can almost augment your network traffic with Kubernetes in mind, and eBPF just makes your network kind of Kubernetes optimized. So it brings, let's wrap it with this. eBPF has the ability, look, it's a great technology anyway, right? And I'm not an expert on it, but from a Kubernetes perspective, it allows you to bring Kubernetes intelligence to your network, or make your network Kubernetes aware, if you will, so that you're not just sitting on top of a regular network, you are sitting on top of a network optimized for Kubernetes. Hey, 2 out of 2 so far that I feel like I've been able to answer. That's a streak.
So we've got some questions, Nigel, from the ticket when people sign up through Eventbrite.
Righto, mate.
We'll grab some of these because and maybe you want to have a scan through the ones that you like from Kubernetes, because I'm sure there's a lot in there. But the first one that we've got from the tickets is from Gokhan. The Docker runtime is being deprecated.
Yeah.
Does it not use Docker files anymore?
Right. Okay. So that harks back to the first question on container D. So I was saying that Docker is a bit too bloated and too full fat for what Kubernetes needs. So using Docker as the runtime to start and stop containers, yes, Kubernetes still does use it, but it's deprecated, meaning that in a future version of Kubernetes, it's going to be next year almost certainly, as in like I doubt it's going to be this year. A future version of Kubernetes will no longer use Docker as the runtime, but it doesn't matter because container D is basically lightweight Docker. So all of the Docker tooling, like to build images and things like that. So like the Docker image build command or the Docker build command builds what's called an OCI image, which is an industry standard image. Kubernetes runs OCI images. So in your tool chain, you would start with your application code and its dependencies, right? It's library files. So your code, Python or whatever. You would then write a Docker file that is a list of instructions that tells Docker how to build that code and dependencies into an OCI image. So Docker files are still valid. You still use, you've got your code and your dependencies, you write your Docker file, and then you run a Docker image build, and it builds an OCI image. You put that in a registry, and Kubernetes can use that. So deprecating Docker as a runtime, has no impact on the value of a Docker file or Docker as a developer build tool. It's literally just the bit at runtime in production that starts and stops containers is no longer going to be full fat Docker. But what we're putting in place still uses everything that Docker builds. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and great. Thank you, Nigel. The next question on the pre-populated ones is edge computing with Kubernetes and its benefits.
You brought my run to an end.
Nice one, Dave.
Yeah.
Well, technically, Nitin's doing this, isn't it?
So you know what? Like from my perspective, one of the biggest benefits of using Kubernetes at the edge or for the edge is just Kubernetes is becoming like just the de facto tool for running workloads, containerized workloads. So if you're running Kubernetes in your cloud and in your on-prem data center and things like that, it almost makes sense to use the same tool and the same skill set within your organization to manage things deployed to the edge, manufacturing devices and things like that, rather than using a different tool. I think the value prop of using containers at the edge is with them being lightweight. We've got the whole like build tool pipelines that are built around containers and stuff that you can leverage at the edge as well. All of the security things that are built around containers, like image vulnerability scanning and all that kind of stuff, to be able to leverage all of that in your build pipeline while you're building containers, and then push the artifacts that come out of that secure small container images to your edge devices and have a common tool like Kubernetes orchestrate them or or versions of Kubernetes, lightweight versions of it, like micro Kubernetes or K3S. Just seems to make sense. Like, why would we have multiple tools if we don't need to? So I feel like my answer streak's still going, even if that one might not be the best answer.
Cool. Well, we're just finishing up the ones in the pre-populated. I'm just seeing who's joining us and who's asked. So we've got Simon Torm. So if I get this wrong, feel free to pop it in the chat because it's a bit of a screen grab. But Simon asks, how to become an engineer to fully understand RBAC and network policies. This is, in my opinion, not clear. And then,
yeah. So again, it's one of the reasons that I wrote the book. I didn't say actually, but although in like today's age of everything's available on the internet, it's so hard to like build a coherent picture sometimes, and a lot of stuff on the internet's out of date and things like that. So I did add an RBAC chapter to the latest version of the book. So securing sort of the API admission process and how RBAC is leveraged there. Again, because I got a lot of requests from end users. So the latest version of the Kubernetes book does have an entire chapter dedicated to, I better double check this. I do so much. API security and RBAC, page 201. Just as full on evidence. But I don't have anything on network policy. So that's not like a way to get Simon to buy my book because, sorry, mate, there's nothing in there on network policy at the moment. One of the reasons about that as well, though, is that I feel like network policy isn't quite baked. It's the same reason that Ingress took a long time to go into the book. I try only to put things in there when I feel like both the project has them as GA or 1.0, like stable, and that the community seems to have agreed on what it's going to look like. I think a lot of what's coming with Ebpf as well is potentially going to have an impact on the way network policy works within Kubernetes. So I'm giving an answer that's kind of like, sorry, Simon, it's not easy to get that, unfortunately. I've waffled, haven't I? Yeah, look, Simon, it's not easy. Yeah, really sorry. I'll look at putting network policy in next year's edition of the book. But that's a really long time to wait. I don't expect you to. Sorry, mate.
I think the final one from the ones that we got pre the webinar is from Traz Wilson, who's put any recommendations on tools for security scanning containers.
So I try and stay away from recommendations, but I don't mind giving one. Just because I haven't, no, it's just because like I don't want somebody to see me as the author of a book and say my recommendation means something is the best, because it doesn't. I get this all the time, right? When people think, well, people know you've written a book, it doesn't mean I've tried every tool and know everything, and I know he'll know that. Look, I just use Docker Hub, which now has integrated security scanning, powered by SNYK, SNYK. It's a really good security scanning tool. The reports that it develops and produces are really good, I think. And we just recently had, excuse me, better take a drink. We just recently had the Open Containers Initiative, the OCI, released a new spec for image distribution. Okay, and it's built around the Docker registry version 2 spec. So I always feel like Docker Hub as a registry is a really good go-to registry for storing your images on, because the format of the entire registry was donated to the community, and now the OCI has written the industry standard spec based around the spec that Docker Hub is built on. So Docker Hub is great, and it has really good image vulnerability scanning, and powered by a third-party company, SNYK, but I do like SNYK as a company and the people there. So that's my recommendation, but others are out there, and I'm not saying that it's particularly the best for your use case, but it's certainly worth a look.
Just go back into the Q&A. I feel like, so like Kedarnath has asked quite a lot of questions, and I don't want to dismiss them. Have you managed to have a quick scan and maybe pick one or two out?
No,
There are quite a few
I've
in there.
not. Let me have a quick look. Where did we get up to? Can two containers within a pod expose on the same port? No. Okay, so a pod, right? So a pod is just a shared set of namespaces for a bunch of containers to go in. So basically, every container that runs inside of a pod, so in this example, let's just call it 2, shares that pod's network stack. So every container in that pod uses the pod's IP address, okay? And it also uses the pod's range of ports. So you can't have 2 containers inside of the same pod exposed on the same port. Because when traffic comes into that pod, on the pod's IP, on let's call it port 8080, there has to be a rule in there that says, getting traffic on port 8080, I forward it to a particular container. So you can't have 2 containers doing different jobs exposed on the same port, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, it's just a design principle. So if you have 2 containers that need to be exposed on the same port, well, for sure they can't go in the same pod, okay? Do Kubernetes certifications really matter? I think that they do. Oh, look, okay. Look, I'm going to write a book on the CKAD, as Ash's question at the beginning joked, and we're looking to release it by the end of this year. So I wouldn't write the book if I didn't think they matter. Personally, as an individual, right? I find the mixture of experience with certifications is the best approach. I've been in a hiring position in previous jobs where I've been a team leader responsible for hiring new people in. Do I think certifications in general are the greatest things in the world? No. But do I think if you couple a certification with experience, I think that's a great combo. When I was hiring, I would look for that combination. And I think Kubernetes certifications are becoming more and more important. How Kubernetes provisions external storage for pods. Okay, so that's a complex question. I do have an entire chapter in the book. I sound like a right shill here, don't I? Dedicated to how storage from external systems, so it might be your EMCs and your NetApps and things on premises, or it could be elastic block storage if you're running your Kubernetes cluster in AWS or whatever, how that storage is exposed into Kubernetes via plugins, what the container storage interface, what the role that plays there, and then how the persistent volume subsystem like storage classes and persistent volume claims and things, loads of buzzwords. It's in the book, full chapter on it, really too complex to get into now. And is one of the things where I reckon if I look at the book, if I can find the storage chapter, yeah, so quite a few diagrams in there as well. It's something that's not super easy to explain without diagrams, because there are a lot of moving parts in there. So I definitely would suggest the book for that. It's got about 15 pages on it of small text. Right, where are we? Please explain how Proxy actually works. Oh. Right, another really complex one. Service discovery deep dive chapter in the book goes into amazing detail on this. Proxy is basically in charge of networking on individual Kubernetes nodes. So, I'm assuming a lot of prior experience and understanding here. Some of these questions, technical questions, are really hard to answer quickly without having to explain 20 minutes of other stuff you have to understand first. So look, if you understand how a Kubernetes service object works, so you might have, let's say, 10 pods running a web server on port 8080, okay? And that might get scaled up to 20 pods based on demand. So instead of clients making connections to individual pods, they make a connection to a service object that sits in front of the pods, and all clients send traffic to the service object, and the service object load balances over them, over the pods behind. Kube Proxy is effectively responsible for taking the IP address of that service object and mapping it through, in the past it was IP tables rules, but now it's IPVS rules, mapping it to individual pods and containers. It's really low-level stuff done in the kernel on each node that basically traps on traffic going to the service address, because the service address isn't a real address, it's a virtual IP. It causes a trap in the kernel. It says, oh, for any traffic going here, I should then send it on to one of these pods. And that's pretty much one of the main roles of Kube Proxy. But you really need to read the book. I mean this in the best way possible. A lot of these questions are fundamental questions that the book covers in glorious detail, but much more clearly than I can explain now, when I'm kind of looking at the clock and trying to get to other questions as well. So looking at the number of questions that you've asked, I'm pretty sure that the book would be a really good thing for you to buy. Let's have a look for some more. What's the best tool to validate Kubernetes cluster? I'm going to pass on that one because I don't want to make a recommendation on that. Whoa, okay. Docker init versus dumb init. Is that you? So I'm really sorry, Kalesha. I don't know those two tools, Docker init and dumb init. So apologies there. Simon, already got a copy of my book. Do I need to buy the new one every time? That's become very expensive for me. So this is really hard for me as well. Look, Simon, if you private message me, I'm pretty sure I can fork out and post you a copy, as long as you don't live like somewhere where it costs me 50 quid to post it. It's really difficult for me. And I'm honest when I say this, right? I've done my very best to make sure that people get updates free of charge where possible. So if you buy the book on LeanPub, which is an electronic version of the book, you automatically get free updates. If you buy a Kindle version, you can get free updates as well. You do have to contact Kindle support, unfortunately, but they will give you all of the free updates. There just isn't a way for me to be able to say, people that have bought a paperback copy, and I prefer paperback, so this hurts me. But if you bought a paperback copy, there isn't a way for me to say you automatically get a free update. Like I've explained before about the Docker book, like I don't hardly make any money off the paperbacks. The paperbacks are there just because I love a paperback book or a hardback. Those aren't there for me to make any money off. Simon, like if you DM me, mate, and you can show me that you've got an old copy of my book, I'll happily post you one. But if there was a way for me to get free paperbacks to people, I promise you I would do it. But it's just not something that's possible, is it? But Simon, you've come on this call. If you've got a copy of my book, I'll happily post you one. IP tables contract sometimes, most of the time, is causing service communication breaking. I don't get proper explanation of IP. That's a pretty rock hard question, that one, and that we don't have time for. I do know though that I want to say since like Kubernetes 1.14, almost certainly 1.18, it started using IP virtual service, so IPVS instead of IP tables for a lot of stuff because it scaled more. It had better load balancing algorithms and things like that. So I don't know whether a newer version of Kubernetes might help there. I don't know. So that one's quite a complex question. Well, one thing I'll just wrap with is that although I've written books and I've done video courses and clearly I do know some stuff about containers and Kubernetes, I hate doing this, but like I'm super busy, of course. I can't be like free hardcore technical support for people. I don't mind answering fundamental questions and things like that, but you would not believe how many personal messages I get asking for help with long command outputs and things like, what can you fix this for me? And I look at some of them and I'm like, it would take a team of like core maintainer engineers 2 or 3 days to trawl through that and realize that it's a bug and that something needs fixing. So unfortunately, like I wish I had the time to be able to get into every configuration challenge. I haven't. Sorry.
Just a really more simple question.
Go for it, mate.
Now, just been put into the chat rather than Q&A, but Joe is just asked, he's seeing more IT departments getting their devs to build the Docker instances for Kubernetes, therefore no need for sysadmins or DevOps engineers. Is this a trend you're seeing as well?
So I think, right, that Docker and Docker Swarm, which is very similar to Kubernetes, was a lot more developer focused. It was much simpler and it did less on the infrastructure front. What I think is happening is that people are trying to do away with the need for a sysadmin or somebody with sysadmin skills from like a budget perspective and a headcount perspective and things that, IT departments are under pressures. However, Kubernetes is much more, as you get into it and you deploy it as an organization more deeply and extensively within your network, organizations are quickly realizing, well, there's a lot more sysadmin, infrastructure admin going on here than we initially thought. Like, look, you deploy something to your laptop, like, how to deploy my first web container using Kubernetes, get away with that without a sysadmin, easy. You might even deploy your first application or two, greenfield applications, nice, easy ones, put, dabble your feet in the water. When you get serious, you realize you need people with proper infrastructure and sysadmin skills that are battle hardened in all the high availability of everything. Look, a highly available Kubernetes cluster is built on the same high availability principles that every other cluster has been built on for the last 150 years. It's all about getting quorum, the right number of nodes, deploying across different failure domains, all that kind of stuff that is infrastructure admin and sysadmin bread and butter that a lot, not all, but a lot of developers either don't care about or don't have the time to invest in. So I feel that as people get more serious with Kubernetes, they realize that it's the beating heart of their infrastructure and they need to do it properly, which brings the sysadmin and the infrastructure admin back to the party.
Cool. And one last question from me, Nigel.
Go on, Mike.
Where can we buy the book?
Oh, softball question. I should have a rehearsed answer for this, really, shouldn't I? So I think you can pretty much buy it anywhere. Like if you go to nigelpoulton.com, I had it on the, we're not sharing the screen anymore. It doesn't matter. I've got a books tab on there that's got all the, the different places you can buy it from. You can buy electronic copies from LeanPub, and you can buy Kindle and paperback and hardback copies from Amazon. Basically whatever you prefer. And honestly, in this, right, because I've said that I don't get hardly any money from a paperback or a hardback copy, don't think, I feel sorry for Nigel. He's a great guy. I'll buy the electronic copy, even though I prefer a hardback copy. Just buy the hardback copy for yourselves. Because I have had people come to me in the past and say, should I buy from Kindle or from LeanPub? Where do you get the most royalties from? And I really appreciate that. Don't get me wrong. But I've made it available through as many channels and in as many formats as possible for you as a reader, not for me. So if you love a hardback, don't buy the hardback. I get less money for that than I do from buying from LeanPub, but I'm cool with that. But we've made it available in the formats that you want. So yeah, leanpub.com and Amazon. Wherever you live, it's pretty much available everywhere now.
Excellent.
Great.
Raj, are you there?
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Wake up, Raj.
I've learned more about Kubernetes in that hour than I think I'd ever have done previously, and that's not the first Kubernetes event we've done. So thank you very much for your time, Nigel, and thank you to everyone who spent your time with us. And yeah,
one thing we have forgotten, Raj.
Yeah. Who's
the winner?
Oh yeah. So I'm going to give it to that Ebpf question if I can.
Kalesha.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's where it's going. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, Kalesha, if you could DM us in the chat just to us directly, send us your information rather than to everyone. Just send it to us. We'll make sure we get your information.
Yeah, Kalesha. I'll just put my email in the chat there. So if you want to send me an email with your details, and we'll pass that on to Nigel.
Excellent. Well remembered, Mike. And we'll hopefully speak to everybody soon.
Brilliant. Thanks for everyone. Thanks
Thank you,
for
everyone.
joining, and thanks, Nigel.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Yeah. Speak to you soon.
All right.
Yep.
Bye,
Ciao,
everyone.
ciao.